Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for making it to the IIC today. This seminar, Creating a New Curriculum for the Arts, organized in collaboration with the IIC, is the second in a series of many, many more we hope to do. When Marg turned 75, we put together 5 readers that explore the shifting historiographies of writings on art and culture in India through the Marg archive. 5 important readers were published. Readings on the Temple, edited by Naman Ahuja. Readings on Textiles, edited by Abigail S. McGowan. Readings on Dance, edited by Urmimala Sarkar Munshi and Anita Cherian. Readings on Modernism, edited by Shukla Sawant. And Readings on Painting, edited by Dipti Khera and Yael Rice. Once these readers were published, they proved more than just a deeply introspective exercise on the Marg Foundation's own history or contributions. They provided instead an opportunity to survey how these subjects were studied previously and how the questions we are asking in the field have shifted. These volumes come at a time when there is need to think about how these subjects will be written into the social sciences, beyond art history into wider histories, sociology, political studies, economic history, and culture studies. The questions these volumes raise also affect the larger questions on preserving culture and its revivalism, which are part of the curriculum for culture industry professionals. Today, we have Naman Ahuja, Marg's general editor, Urmimala Sarkar Munshi, Anita Cherian, Mayank Mansingh Kaul, who will be filling in for Abigail McGowan, Shukla Sawant, and Dipti Khera, who will be talking about the respective volumes in the 75 years of Marg series. The first speaker for the seminar will be Dr. Naman P. Ahuja. He is professor at the School of Arts and Aesthetics at JNU. He is also the general editor of Marg Publications, which is India's oldest publishing house dedicated to art and culture. He is a widely published author whose scholarship has deepened our understanding of Indian art from the perspectives of visual culture, aesthetics, iconography, and transculturalism. His books have been widely translated into French, Spanish, and Dutch. He has curated some of the most important exhibitions of Indian art in the past 10 years, including The Body in Indian Art and Thought and India and the World. The exhibitions have received critical acclaim in responding to the pressing requirements of relevant narratives of India within a globalized world that are cognizant of issues of caste, gender, comparative religion, and decolonization. So, without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Naman Ahuja on stage.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for being here. And it's been, here we are, a great privilege to be able to work with one's colleagues to pull out readings from our archive on these 5 subjects that you see on the board. Previously, the Modern Architectural Review Group, as it was founded by Mulk Raj Anand in 1946, along with his peers, which included very illustrious people in the 1940s, they were confronted with a particular dilemma, which was on how they were going to deal with a new India. What would be the spirit for a modern India, which had to be modern and at its own terms, not modern in the way that it was defined for us because of colonialism. Was there going to be a route towards modernity that could bypass the colonial? There wasn't. Was there going to be a way in which the traditional could be revived without being atavistic and being burdened by the idea of tradition? How could tradition be mobilized in a productive way moving forward without being encumbered by its superstition or being encumbered by its misgivings, that all the baggage that comes with an inheritance? The dilemmas that Mulk Raj Anand and others faced in the mid-1940s are not too different from the dilemmas we continue to face now. And when the subject of decolonization has become so important again, one really needs to revisit that moment of the mid-1940s to 50s to be able to assess what was the nature of defining the post-colonial moment then, and how is that different from defining the decolonization moment now? And are we able to really make a distinction, and can we put paid to all of the ways in which the definitions were cast and the spirit by which the curriculum was created, and a new definition for Indian museums, curatorial narratives, etc. was established, why the state academies were created with the manifestos that they were, what happened with Kathak Kendra and Sangeet Natak Academy, what happened with the National School of Drama and the Sahitya Academy, what happened, of course, with the Lalit Kala Academy, NGMA, and the various national museums of India. We confront this problem because of another reason. For more than 20 years, there have been more than 90 vacancies in the National Museum of India that have not been filled. You're all aware of this. We've brought it up in the media time and again. Why? Why are we unable to come up with people in India who are fit to run those institutions? Why are there so many of these major institutions in India that don't have trained personnel in the field of traditional arts and history, art history, museology? Why is it? We're given to understand, the opposition claims that it's because there are no jobs for the youth of India to fill. The youth of India tell us they have degrees, but they're not being hired. And the people on the selection committees tell us that they aren't finding people who are fit for the job. So somewhere there is, in the middle of this impasse, a tremendous problem in governance that we are confronted with. And we do need to think about how we are going to think about, we do need to think about our curricula and what we are doing in our fields that is letting this gap remain. We come to this at a time when India is making pledges all over the world to create bigger and larger museums than any other country in the world, but we haven't got personnel to be able to fill the posts in our existing institutions, yet we are going to create all these grand institutions that the media is awash with the news about. Where are the personnel going to come from to run those institutions? So it became quite pertinent to think about how the people who were creating these institutions in the 1950s and 60s, how they were defining the field, and what kind of articles and nature of copy they were filling the environment with, what was considered the intelligentsia at that time. So I had very fruitful conversations with Shukla Sawant, Abigail McGowan, Urmimala Sarkar Munshi and Anita Cherian, with Dipti Khera, Yael Rice, but also with several other specialists in the field who didn't edit these volumes, but are very well-known specialists in the field, whether in the United States, in Europe, in the United Kingdom, some in Australia. And there was a long consultative process before the thematics, the editorial thematics of what are the kind of burning issues that we are confronted with today need to be the kind of filter through which, the historiographic filter, through which we're going to assess the Marg archive. Now, Marg has produced some 450 odd articles in the field of temple art and architecture. As my other guest editors will tell you, approximately 300 plus in each of the other fields that you see on the board, on the screen. And that makes it, we're looking at a good 1,400 articles that are dealing with these subjects alone. About 10, 15 years prior, Marg had published a similar reader, but in the field of modern architecture. And so I didn't consider it appropriate to so quickly do another reader in the field of architecture, which is why that one is missing from this set of 6, actually, rather than 5. But the imperatives that guided the selection, the subject matter for the one on architecture, was slightly different compared to the kind of social science questions that we are asking of the ones in these 5 volumes. Mulkraj Anand had been quite prescient, I should say, in the kind of questions and editorials that he put out. I'll just read out some of the ones, some quotes. As the discovery of India proceeds, as we make efforts to inherit our past culture, we begin to realize that the gaps in our knowledge of the various historical periods are almost as vast as the centuries through which our ancient culture was built up. India was on a fact-finding mission. It wasn't simply there to interpret the canon or reinterpret the past. It was still discovering the past. It was still in a position where vast patches of history and archaeology were still coming to light, and a forum was required for a discussion of the material and its implications. And Marg provided such a forum. And so scholars would periodically be given bodies of material, or photographers would be sent marching to sites. George Michel and John Fritz have fantastic stories about how Mulk did not believe that Vijayanagar was ever a site that was going to be worth covering, and in how he stopped en route to somewhere in further south, driving from Bombay, and stopped at Hampi to meet both of them. And he was so flabbergasted by the extent of what he saw that the next thing that happened was that Marg commissioned a series of volumes on Vijayanagar, and George Michel became one of the most consistent writers for Marg afterwards. Now, this is just one episode on how the fact-finding missions of Marg carried on. My other collaborators in this process, in these readers, will tell you about the kind of volumes ways in which Marg pioneered scholarship. But the scholarship was also coming at a time when there were raging debates in India in the 1950s about classical versus folk, Desi and Margi. You must remember Mulk's oeuvre as a fiction writer, and what he stood for, and the kind of politics that he espoused as a writer and as a poet. So there was no question of leaving marginalized communities marginalized in Marg. It had consistently made an effort to be as inclusive as possible. As state formation carried on in India, different state governments, as every new state province was created in India, various chief ministers of states would contact Marg to be able to create a cultural profile for their state. And so volumes began to come out, very much in the cause of nation building, a homage to Karnataka, homage to Haryana, homage to whatever. Every state, as it got created, needed a new package on what would define the culture of that state. And it was very carefully calibrated. How much folk, how much classical, how much ethnographic material, how much archaeological material, what was going to make up the bouquet that created the identity of that state in different ways. So there was clearly an editorial policy that can be governed when one takes a historiographic look at the Marg archive as a whole. This had been slightly misunderstood in the past 10 years, 15 years, because Marg began to be misunderstood as just being another cultural magazine, but not a journal that had been committed to and so deeply invested in the cause of nation building. And Marg was not the only journal of its times. There were other journals as well, but Marg happens to have survived. Modern Review and Rupam and others have, and even Lalit Kala has been sort of on rocky ground for many years. So it's been quite informative to be able to use one journal's publishing profile and look at it. It's now about 78, 79 years old, but look at 75 years of its publishing from 1946 onward to see what are the shifts in it. The other wonderful thing about the archive is that almost all the leading scholars in the world in every field that we have mentioned have articles in Marg. And so the kind of variety of voices that you get across the Marg archive is quite fantastic. It's unrivaled. If there was anyone who needed to look at how 20th century scholarship was, what was 20th century scholarship in the field of using visual culture to construct histories of India, whether it is any of these fields, you will certainly find them having published in Marg. Now, at some point in its history, 25 years into its own creation, Mulkraj Anand did a reassessment of what Marg stood for. And there's another quote: ever since its inception, Marg has sought to make a new kind of critical approach towards Indian artworks. We do not think that we have succeeded in changing the trend of Indian art criticism amongst all our contributors, but we did put forward overtly and by implication certain hypotheses which are beginning to be shared among a number of students, especially of the younger generation, so that there has been visible a clear shift of emphasis from what was called the old criticism to the new criticism. And this was very much a definitional shift that Marg was trying to seek in the nature of its editorial copy. Now, let me start demonstrating some of these issues. I can try and do it through the subject that I edited a volume on, which was on the subject of temple art and architecture. Now, this is a hot subject at the moment, with the coming of the museum in Ayodhya that is dedicated to Indian temple art and architecture, with the nature of the way temples are being mobilized for the sake of politics, with Rath Yatras that have been dominant in the Indian environment in mobilizing public support for the past 25, 30 years. So now we need to ask if these things are anomalous or these very much part of the Indian ethos, and was the agenda from 1940 and till 1992 amnesiac? Was it trying to forget what had been a regular practice that there was an interregnum in? Or, because if these things have such long histories for mobilizing political support in the way that they are, then the more fool us for not having wisened up to it longer and for keeping it out of the curriculum in the way that we did. So what will be the terms at which we will include these issues in the curriculum, and how will we talk about them becomes the critical question. What tone will we adopt when we talk about them? So what are the different kinds of histories that can be written on temple worship? How do we categorize the subject? Should we do it by types of temples in a taxonomic manner, like the way art historians are wont to do? Should we do it by region and talk about every written principality and allow for pluralism to be done in the usual way by talking about geographic diversity, which is a modus operandi that we have often followed in our books in India? Do we do it by chronology? Do we do it by religious community? Do we deal with Shaiva temples, Vaishnav temples, Ganapatya, Saurya temples, etc.? Do we do it by that system? Do we do it by public temples and private temples? How do we divide our curriculum? How do we do it? Because there are completely different histories that would come up as a result. What have been the main shifts and changes in the understanding of the subject in the past 75 years? What are the new approaches to the subject? And what is the current view on old controversies? How do we revisit those old controversies in today's climate? This has proved, these set of questions guided the chapter plan for the creation of this. And what we did was that we selected key articles from the archive out of hundreds that were available. They were summarized. The value or the positioning of that article has been summarized by the guest editor in 2-3 short paras on why we need to look back at that scholarship, or how we need to look back at that scholarship of the 1940s, 70s, whatever. Large-scale pictures and ground plans make this visual narrative as much a text-based study, and hyperlinks that are provided at the end along with each article can allow the student to read, if it's a précis, can allow them to read the full study online. And that makes the online form of engagement with this archive as dynamic as the hard copy. Now, I find that looking at ground plans and poring over them and scribbling on them and marking it up is a lot easier on a 350 or a 500 rupee magazine, which becomes like a kind of an affordable reader because you can't color photocopy and make available the Marg reader for yourselves at that kind of subsidized price at which we make it available as publishers. And so the print copy still holds value, but it needs to be complemented with an online version that you can look at. But you can't really annotate the online one as happily as you can a print one, I feel, as a learning exercise. So we've gone back to the original large format and given people enough white space to be able to scribble on it and use it. I decided to divide the volume chronologically, but within each chronological frame to raise certain variables in each one so that the same issues come up in each chapter. And that becomes a certain consistent spread. Now, the very first question that needs to be asked in the whole question of temple art and architecture is, who wants temples? Who cares? Why do we need them? Why is it important for history, given the fact that temples are not essential for Hindu worship at all? Right? And there's always been a raging debate whether to image worship or not to image worship. Nirgun, Arup, Nirakar become manifestos for most Hindu religious sects and vital terms. So if you believe in those three words, what value have you for temple art and architecture? Who cares? So let's first get that record straight. That's essential, that temple worship matters to some. And if you're trying to create a civilizational history on the basis of temple art and architecture, then it is a civilizational history of some, not all. What makes temples valid or legitimate spaces to worship and invoke the divine is quite interesting, even this question in historical debates. So in Smarta Brahman rituals in Western India and the Konkan, Gudrun Buneman had done a fantastic study by looking at the very mobility and migratory nature of the population and saying that a mandir and a temple can be created because of the mandal that someone makes anywhere. 5 household powders are required to be able to, for every particular ritual, to create a mandal over there, and the members of the family are congregated, and right there and then the ritual is held. That is the temple for that moment, and the ritual ends. An hour later, the chanting ends, and the mandal is thrown off, it's brushed away. That's the end of your temple worship. So it's a temple on the move. It's a temple in the mind, and it's knowledge that's kept in the head, and it's not actually manifest into a physical infrastructure at all. At Chidambaram, you have 2 garbhagrihas. One garbhagriha contains no image. It is the temple to nothingness, which has to be an empty void that has to be looked at or worshipped. So I think certain principles have to be there before we get all hopped up about repatriation of murtis, living murtis, heritage being taken away, etc., etc. I think some calibration needs to be there on whose rituals we are talking about. In terms of revisiting old scholarship on the origins of temple worship going back to megalithic societies, there were some excellent and very provocative pieces by Professor Shettar, who looked at the idea of revisiting the old Aryan versus Dravidian debate, and said that if temple worship was a product of sedentary cultures which were Dravidian in nature, going back to ancient societies, then it is certainly the older megalithic societies that must be prized open in order to be able to study whether they had a foci for worship such as a temple, because it certainly isn't there across the Vedic record, right? The temple worship and urban construction and urban settlement patterns that we are trying to seek aren't there in the Vedic record. So since they're not there in the Vedic record, where do we look for such histories? And can we then have a more mobilized history of Dravidian India rather than being misled all the time in nomenclatures and start calling it an Arya history? Because this isn't part of Arya worship if we are trying to reconstruct these histories. Now, this is a very powerful and important set of questions which remains sort of slightly mistakenly sort of obfuscated in today's history teaching, which remains a really valid question for us to revisit. And so, of course, there were certain egregious and problematic things in the lingo that was being used by Mulk Raj Anand and others, because they wrote about temple art and architecture all through in a certain parlance which is impossible for us to use today. They keep talking about Aryan culture and so on, which is language that we really can't use because we don't know what they really mean when they're talking about those terms, which are problematic words. On what basis are they defined? There are some seats here in front. Why don't you come here? There are some seats here. We also go back to assessing how research has shifted our understanding of the idea of a temple, the meaning behind its sculptures, new research that has been done on iconography, deepening studies on localized Puranic traditions, and Phyllis Granoff's studies of, for instance, cave temples and rock-cut architecture was quite pioneering. R.N. Mishra was commissioned by, Ramanath Mishra was commissioned by Karl Khandalawala at one stage to, since he was professor at Sagar University in those days, to survey the Madhya Pradesh temples of the Gupta period and produce a fantastic study for Marg, which was one of the first proper listings alongside V.S. Agrawal's on Gupta art and architecture. Indira Peterson has done detailed studies not just of the Sanskrit Mahapurans, but looking at the Chidambaram Sthala Purans to be able to localize the myth of Shiva's dance. And so we come up with this thing about local histories, regional histories, and pan-national histories. And what is portrayed as the classical national narrative through the Gupta Empire versus the localized narrative. I've very carefully constructed these debates looking at Tamil regional identity, Gupta national hegemony. You know, how do we posit this debate? Why do we, there's a reason why these two articles are being positioned beside each other as a learning outcome, as a becoming familiar with a certain kind of debate that exists. We talk about deepening our research in the social sciences on the one hand of what value is eroticism in the history of Indian art. Devangana Desai's pioneering studies from the mid-1970s remain absolutely foundational to our understanding even today for temple art and architecture. And those books do actually, her writings are so illuminating because they fly in the face of a lot of received wisdom about what is the nature of Hindu tradition. They were pioneering then, and they remain sort of inspiring even now. Benjamin Fleming has done new research on the Jyotirlingas and the idea of bringing the world into one temple complex. So how every temple tries to become microcosmic of certain ideas which are dealing with a South Asian mapping. What we're trying to get at is that tradition is not static or arrested. Innovations in Indian temples were constant. Now, the Bhitargaon temple is a good one to assess, and wonderfully, the article on the Bhitargaon temple was done at a very early date by R. Nath, who is usually known to us for his work on Sultanate and Mughal architecture. And he, asking him to do this study of Bhitargaon was very good because he could absolutely incontrovertibly tell us that the arches that have been used in Bhitargaon are certainly true arches. They are arcuate buildings. They are voussoir construction. This is not cobbled architecture. Right? And Hindu art and architecture was considered to be the traditional business of cobbled architecture up until Balban's tomb brings in the true arch into India and for the first time. No, there is Bhitargaon to look at. But where did Bhitargaon get it from? Did it invent it? Certainly not. The Roman Empire had been using true arches, Byzantium had been using true arches, which means that the entire Byzantine tradition of architecture was known to the engineers in Kanpur Dehat at the time when Bhitargaon was being constructed, because it is following a similar system of construction. And that needs to be borne in mind, that ideas and innovations in temple art and architecture continued constantly. And there is no singular tradition of temple art and architecture. Every region has its own distinct history of innovations. So Odia temples, Bengali temples, Bir Singh Deo, the great friend of Salim and then Jahangir, built his own remarkable temples for Orchha, which he wanted to create as a rival to Vrindavan, right? If Raja Man Singh was the favored one for Akbar, Bir Singh Deo, because of his friendship with Jahangir, was going to create a second Vrindavan on the ghats of Orchha, where the great poets of Hindi language were going to collect and congregate and come up with an oeuvre of literature. And look at the temples. Look at the interior of those temples. With those grand Ivans, one would hardly imagine that this is the great champion of Hindu religion and its revivalism in the 17th century. So, there are interesting developments like this, and no city shows a greater assimilation of these styles than Banaras itself, where we have the use of domes and arches more than in any other temple town, as a part of temple art and architecture, incorporated completely into the very understanding of a temple, where domes and arches become part of the fabric of the city. And every mandap will have a dome and an arch, which are constructed not in the cobbled tradition, but constructed in the Vuswa tradition, alongside cobbled shikhars. So you get an interesting mixture of architectural tradition, and this simultaneity of looking at the innovations in Indian temple art and architecture is quite important. How do you convert a Catholic, Portuguese, or Iberian basilica or cathedral into inspirational design for a temple? Why do Goan churches start looking the way they do? This brings us also to other examples in the country on issues of patronage. Some temples we know were built out of a sense of piety. That is what we are usually told. But very often, temples are built as victory monuments to make an emphatic public statement about someone's religious victory in the name of religion. That has a very long history of doing this. You also pray to certain deities, especially occult deities, when you need protection of a particular kind. And so the inscriptional record is quite interesting, because it exposes the nature of the vulnerabilities that a particular empire may be facing. So the study of temple art and architecture becomes as much a study of the bolshiness of a particular political apparatus, as much as it becomes about the study of the vulnerabilities of that particular kingly apparatus, whatever that might be. And that makes it an interesting way to be able to look at different temples. Temples also come up around civic amenities. The requirement to provide and protect certain civic amenities like water networks, tanks, canal systems need protection. And so an entire habitus grows around the waterworks and the control over the waterworks. And of course, these controls over the waterwork systems become casteist. And so you get prakara walls for those who can come into the inner sanctum near the spring, and those who come into the outer areas and the further outer areas, And so there are hierarchies in the way the way urbanism works, temple urbanism works. And that in itself becomes an interesting exercise. So we have a few ideas and a few examples of something like this. Now this brings us to how long will the public tolerate the king's mandate, right? Are there rebellions in history against the temple and against the god king? And what have been the rebellions in the past? So a very good example comes from Nepal over here, where the Nyatapul temple of Bhaktapur, the priest decided that he was going to, after the earthquake, was going to rebuild the temple one floor higher than the palace. And the king was in a difficult situation, says no, that his building had to be the tallest building on the horizon. And so we have a fight between church and state. And is the God's house going to be taller, or is the king's house going to be taller? And so a resolution to that debate and the documentation of that debate becomes an interesting way for us to be able to see how public record actually works out narratives and escape routes through such difficult situations. Now, another reason why temples are built and the way they look, and very often forgotten, is that temples are very often just memorials, family memorials. So somebody makes a temple for their deceased ancestor. It's like making a tomb. But you make a temple and you open it up for the public good. In time, it just becomes a temple to a particular deity that people are going to pray at, but the punya of having made that temple accrues to the family and to the deceased. So the purpose and the intention behind making a Pallipadai in South India or making one of those Mandor temples outside Jodhpur, these are all grand temples either in the Shekhari style or in the Dravida style, but they are not made out of acts of piety to God. They are actually made as acts of piety in memory of mummy and daddy. And so there is a fundamental difference unto why we have so many temples in India and what is driving people to make this art. The motivation for making this art comes out of a personal imperative rather than always coming out of a public imperative of piety. So that also needs to be factored in and looked at as to how does this work. Now, of course, temple patrons have left us information on who they chose as their architects, as well as a rich context for their aesthetic decisions. I think we've often also not quite understood what was the nature of the education of some of these great temple patrons. The Samarangan Sutradhar, written by Raja Bhoj, is a landmark book in the history of temple art and architecture. And you can't really study this material study the great heights of medieval temple art and architecture without thinking of such an erudite patron as an architect, polyglot like Raja Bhoj. So you have his temple drawings and studies, but you also have Pattadakal, where we have information of the Chalukyan queens who supported and sponsored temples. And so you think about female patronage, women who had enough resources to be able to sponsor the construction of temples. And did they control the exchequer? Were they ruling as regents in the name of their sons or fathers, or were they actually patrons in their own right? And what is the nature of their patronage? Now, just as it is important to think about why somebody had a temple built in the first place, we also need to think about why someone was interested in keeping it going or renovating it 400 years or 500 years or even 1,000 years after it had been constructed. So it's all very well to celebrate 1,000 years of Tanjavur Brihadishwara and talk about Rajaraja Chola. But it would be also rather nice to be able to talk about the many other people who have made sure that that edifice is still standing 1,000 years later, because Rajaraja Chola's building is certainly not what we are looking at in its pristine glory. We're looking at something to which there has been significant Maratha contribution in terms of its restoration and renovation, and subsequently what happened to it during colonial times when it became an armory and a quartermaster's store, and then how it was revived and it was restored. And what are the politics of such restoration work? How important is this revivalism? Is it ethical to remove old murtis, or should temples be left to fall to ruin? What position should the government take? When does it become interference with the fabric of an old building? And at what point should we withdraw? Now, the Cholas took a Satavahana building at Guddimallam, which was an apsidal temple, an old apsidal temple, and they renovated it. They left the Moola Murti in the Garbhagriha and they renovated it. So we know that there was a 10th century renovation of a 2nd century monument. We know that in the time of the Vijayanagara kings, there was a way of reviving the past. There was a conscious revivalism, and Swami Malai and places were mobilized into creating new murtis in the Chola style to be able to reuse in the Chola renovated temples that were happening under the Vijayanagara and Nayaka kings. So there is revivalism. So the idea of a renaissance is not something that happens in India only post-independence and a revivalism in the national movement and so on. The idea of a renaissance of culture and using history to validate your present is something that has happened many times. The Gupta monarchs and their invocation of the Ashwamedha, which we learn about in our history classes. Can we mirror that exercise in our art history classes in some way? Can we see that how the past is being mobilized for the present in certain ways at different times, and what is the effect of that mobilization of the past, of history in the contemporary? And which are the different contemporaries in different moments in time that have tried to quote from the past? How? Now we come to another debate, and I'm staging it as a debate, as a controversy, rather than taking a position on the matter. In which languages are the Shastras on temples written, and how do we account for their divergent views? So, for instance, it was very important for students of temple art and architecture to be able to look at the Sanskrit canon of books and manuals written, the Agamas and the Shilpa Shastras, etc. But Vidya Dehejar once wrote, as one of the former editors of Marg, a scathing review and assessment of the entire temple art and architecture project that was happening with the American Institute of Indian Studies, and said this fantastic collaboration between Michael Meister and Professor Dhaki and others who had come together to create the grand encyclopedia of Indian temple art and architecture was extremely informative, very, very rich, but who was it aimed at as a publication, is what she was asking. Because with the extent of very precise Sanskrit terminology that is used for every little molding and cornice and wall and curlicue has a Sanskrit term for it. Now what is wonderful is that the curlicue's term in one Sanskrit text is not identical to how it is in a second Sanskrit text. What makes it all more confounding is that if you read it in a medieval Gujarati text, it'll be different from a medieval Tamil Agama. Now, if the medieval craftsman or pilgrim is visiting from Gujarat to Tamil Nadu, in what language was he describing what he was seeing in Tamil Nadu when he went on his national pilgrimage to the Shakti Sthals, or to the Shakti Peeths, or to the Jyotirlings, which they were doing? So, was Sanskrit being used as the lingua franca of exchange to be able to talk about these temple murtis and temple features, or were they using regional vernaculars of the 12th and 14th centuries? Because there is the terminology and the expertise exists in regional language texts as much as it exists in Sanskrit language texts. So by the time we become postgraduate students, then the question is, should the curriculum, to what extent must the curriculum start introducing this vocabulary of art history to the students? because there is a specialized art history vocabulary for all the parts of a temple, and it would be remiss to not be able to study temple art and architecture at its own terms, but which terms should we select? Should we be selecting the Gujarati ones over the Sanskrit ones, and so on, the Tamil ones over the Gujarati ones? These are questions that come up in some of these studies. Studying regionalism is fruitful, but we also need to see certain pan-Indian similarities where we least expect them. So, of course, at an undergraduate level, we introduce students to Nagara and Dravida, but then we start seeing that there are actually so many different types of Nagara and so many different types of Dravida buildings. And then you start seeing these kinds of buildings with pitched roofs, Sandhara temples, whether they are located, Sarvota Bhadra, four-sided temples which are in the middle of a water body with pitched roofs. And then you see them in Karnataka, and you see them in Kashmir, and you see them in Nepal, and then you see that they actually have a following which is across the board in South Asia, and they're not limited to one regional type. So some kind of an understanding of a common vocabulary has to exist alongside a vocabulary of regional specificity. So that dilemma has to be introduced at some point to the curriculum as well. What about temples in Nepal, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Indonesia, Thailand, and Sri Lanka? Temples and their traditions are not, sorry, Thailand comes twice in that list. Maybe it's not so difficult. We can cut one variable down. Temples and their traditions are not limited to India, right? So how do we introduce these things? I found it rather interesting that Tara Ali Beg had been invited by Marg to write an article on the temples of Cambodia, Champa, and Laos. The choice of writers that had been selected by Marg at different times is also quite revealing of the politics of the Bandung years and the leading up to a certain non-aligned investment. Why was it necessary to have these kinds of writers who were expressive of the plural traditions of South Asia, writing for Marg and on things like temple art and architecture? And I think there is something that we can do at a level of assessing the politics of Marg. But I want to not spend time on that so much right now, but I wish to come back to the main point, right? How do we wish to present the history of temples in these regions? Is the study of Southeast Asia evidence for Indian cultural colonialism? Now, colonialism, as we now define it commonly, is a system whereby you take the raw materials and resources of some land for your profit, right? So whether it comes to all the timber trade and gold and silver that is being taken and spices that are taken from Southeast Asia and traded by Indians to the rest of the world, doesn't seem to be very different if put in those terms from being colonial. What happens when you think about colonialism as the imposition of your school's lingua franca systems of knowledge, usurping others' systems of knowledge and replacing them at the higher echelons with your own? If that is the definition of colonialism, then the Puranic apparatus certainly achieved that with great aplomb across Southeast Asia, right? So, as we wax eloquent about a decolonizing narrative, how are we going to deal with the Southeast Asia narrative? Right? That's the first question that we ourselves need to pose as a mirror. We need to ask this question quite squarely, that are we going to be quite happy to be chest thumping and patriotic about our spread in Southeast Asia and having oppressed and colonized and subverted their cultural history, while at the same time complaining that something similar was done to us 500, 700, 1,000 years later? This is not a dilemma that I am staging for the first time, nothing new. This was the whole business of the people who were thinking about Bandung and using the national vocabulary. The reason why the Ashoka Chakra and the four-headed lion, etc., are chosen as the national symbol of India was to be able to create solidarities with Southeast Asia for certain very clear political reasons in terms of all of these things. So if that is being done at that time in the 1940s and 50s, perhaps we need to revisit what were the terms at which histories were being written about Southeast Asian Hinduism and temples, and what were the politics that were invested in that, and we need to be a little bit careful about how we position this. So clear articles have come out in Marg on some of these issues. Mahalakshmi, for instance, wrote about Beyond the Politics of Conquest, how do we deal with Sri Lankan Hinduism. Alessandra Lopez Arroyo Ayer wrote a very important study of the Natya Shastra and the Karanas of dance movements on the Prakara walls of Prambanan in Indonesia. And then I want to end, I'm not ending, but I also want to remind the public that temples were not made only for Hindus, but were also made for other religions in South Asia, and they have their own orders of temple art and architecture, whether it is Buddhist or Jain. Temples exist because they are ways to gather publics, to mobilize the public in some way. So pilgrimage temples. Now these pilgrimage towns and pilgrimage temples perform a fundamental economic function. They don't exist for the pious citizens of that particular state. They exist because they attract foreigners. They exist because they attract the Pardesi. Right? They exist, they are constructed, the Gadwali temples are constructed so that pilgrims from all over India can visit and go to the Char Dham. They're not made for people of Gadwal. Right? They were always constructed. Ayodhya's politics has been to spread an Ayodhya to Thailand, to Mathura to Madurai, and so on. These are temples that are created and temple towns that are created in the imagination so that they may attract pilgrims from all over the world. So the infrastructure Ashoka Maurya might have put down at Lumbini was done with farsightedness to be able to attract pilgrims there for the next 2,000 years. There is a lasting legacy to constructing temple towns. So why are we so surprised about what's happening in Banaras or Puri or Ayodhya or whatever? I mean, this part of the course. Is this not what happens? So how do we situate the contemporary developments in these places in relation to how these developments were conceived previously? Because these developments have always happened. It's just our amnesia that hasn't accorded them their space in history. So these things have always been going on. So the Panchakroshi, somebody built a temple over a shop. And he put you can have darshan of all the 108 temples of Banaras by going to this one temple quickly and just going and doing a circumambulation of it. And you can go shopping downstairs. Right? So now, the economics of pilgrimage and creating such towns, this is quite interesting because you see this being done in history too. Now, as I was saying, temple festivals exist, Rath Yatras exist, but why do they have so much political power? And it's for all those people that are denied entry into the temple, where you have the opportunity, until the Vaikum temple entry movement permits everyone access to the Garbhagriha, until then, you have entire caste marginalization where you have a whole history of people being denied access into the temple. So whose temple, whose history, but at the same time, if people are not entering the temple, well then God is going to the people, right? And these big Rath Yatras are constructed and urbanism of the city is linked to these Rath Yatras. And so the annual Rath Yatra has a lot of validity for the public. The temple is a space for cultural history. That's the next issue. And the temples are places where dance traditions and festive traditions, not just the Rath Yatras, survive, in which case they need to be studied as spaces for culture. as stages for culture and not just as places for worship of idols. And it's an auditorium space. It's a cultural habitat. And so it needs to be looked at in that way. But what one needs to be vigilant about, again, is that ancient living culture should not be misunderstood to imply that it has not been progressing or that it has been arrested in the past. We need to use ethnoarchaeology with caution, or there can be well-intentioned but sociologically disturbing mistakes when making policy on these matters. Now, this brings us to contemporary practitioners. How should they go about their practice? When we are teaching architecture, for instance, what should temple builders today do? When can tradition be sacrificed? What are the challenges and dilemmas that modern architects face? Can they be emboldened by understanding that temples have always been an innovative space, whether at Bhitargaon or at Banaras, and seeing that the latest trends were always being incorporated into temple art and architecture, so that if they wish to make modern temples today out of modern materials, that should be a liberating space for them as designers, and not as people who are bound to not use new materials. And this brings me towards the end, as I wrap up. Then we come to what of the training for these architects, sthapatis, and shilpis. How has technology impacted their work? Has the memento-making crafts market replaced the traditional nature of temple sculpture, which is there for worship? And what is happening in today's day and age with artisans who, by caste regulation, are still being prevented from entering some of the garbhagrihas where they have created the idols? So how does that work out? And what are the ways by which they would study this material themselves? Now, I end with another quote of Mulk's. Unfortunately, the pride of our political leaders, he's writing this, please, not now. He wrote this in 1955, this particular quote. I think it's 55, if I'm not wrong. So please position his quote against the political leaders of 1955. Unfortunately, the pride of our political leaders, to whom the splendors and glories of our heritage are mostly slogans flung at the world to cover the paucities of our present-day achievement, prevent the cultivation of a mood of true humility about our ignorances. But the charge made against India of disregarding the knowledge of history through our preference for the vertical truths of religion and metaphysics will have to be acknowledged. And the necessary effort made to compile source books from which an adequate tradition of historical writing may spring up, and intensive research in the social and political periods fostered. I hope I've been able to communicate something of his intention through my summary of what was going on in the kind of articles that Marg has managed to pull out of its archive on temple art and architecture. And I hope you'll be able to see that across the board in the other disciplines that we will cover this afternoon. So thank you. I'll be happy to address any questions that you may have.
You can just raise your hand and we'll send a mic over to you.
Yes.
Thank you for a brilliant presentation. I'm going to try and connect two dates. One, the quote from Mulk Rajanandan from 1955 and today. And 1955 because that was the year of the Bandung Conference. And India had a pivotal role in that. And there were leaders from Africa, from Latin America, from the Middle East. Nasser was there, Nehru was there, etc. And so this colonialism, eastward colonialism that you delineated seemed to be very interesting. But my question is, why has India in 2024 kind of retreated from the Bandung moment? I'll stop there.
I think that's a very different disciplinary question to what I was addressing. You're coming straight into international relations and foreign affairs, not my field. I shan't be able to, I can't. I think, yes, no, art history certainly deals with geopolitics. And that's exactly the reason why I selected a lot of this material, because I think a lot of the questions that we are confronted with at the moment, I was surprised as to how much resonance and relevance they had for us, as if I was reading it as if it was addressing my problems today. Some of the articles and some of the issues that those articles were responding to, it seemed as if, they were still so relevant. And so it was also a question of assessing why was this writing unable to achieve its goals, that the issues have come back to haunt us with even greater force than they had hit us in the 1950s. Why are they hitting us with even more now? Perhaps that's the question to be asked. That if this was a relevant body of writing then, why has it become even more pressing now? And isn't that an extraordinary failure of this writing and of this body of material in not having had the success it should have had? And so that, I think, was the larger question that I was affected by, that where did this writing go wrong? Because it seems very well intentioned. It seems very well thought out. So why has it left us in the mess that we're in? And so perhaps there are answers to that in different ways, and I think this body of people here will be able to perhaps think about it, that was it inadequately translated into Hindi and into Tamil? Is that one of the reasons? Did it not reach out? Did the curriculum setting not voice the reasons for these debates adequately to the public? That what are the dangers of not following this line of approach? Do we not make people feel responsible early enough for carrying certain narratives forward? Is that going to be more helpful as a tone of writing and implicating them rather than being didactic towards the reader? These are strategies for people who work in education to advise on, I feel. And I certainly don't want this conversation that is being sparked today amongst us to stop here. I would be very grateful if this consultative process could actually carry on, as Mansi correctly announced, with other bodies and other institutions across the board, because I think we all need to take the initiative in our respective universities to be able to ask these questions, both practical as to where we are going wrong with our curriculum setting and what we can do, and our rationale for that. And I think we need to put our rationale down as much as possible. Any?
There is another important issue. Whether a particular monument is historical or mythological. I went to Ayodhya specifically. I am from the income tax department, and I am not a astrologer. I went to Ayodhya just to see सीता की वो जो जहाँ वो बनाती थी मिठाई वगैरह सीता की रसोई. Now I was able to see so many dysfunctional narratives that have been given that it could not be. सीता की रसोई वो ऐसी बना रखी है जैसे आजकल की modern रसोई होती है. Now all that thing is a fraud. So I think there should be some sort of a study as to what is history and what is mythology and what is a creation, so that people know what our history was.
Yeah, this is a serious problem in my field, in dealing with a lot of ancient temples. Every temple we visit, it's a temple to the Pandavas, or the length and breadth of India. There is a usual narrative. There are layers and layers of narratives that are there at every site. There will be an inscription at the site which will tell you that it was created for a particular deity. But that's not what the popular culture believes, and that is not what is the regular system around that site, and everyone now worships that temple in a completely different way. And so you're very right, it becomes contingent on the part of, it becomes the responsibility of the historian to be able to let us know what the evidence for older dedication and inscriptions, etc., were at that site. That's one way of illuminating the public about those things. But just because something went a particular way originally doesn't make it right or wrong. You know, I mean, that needs to be kept in mind. It's just, that's a, people's popular worship is not what we are talking about or intervening in. Our field is to be able to present the history and the historical facts as best we can, but we are not here to tell the people what to do at the site and how they must worship. There's a question here.
Thank you, Naman, for covering so much ground in such a short space of time, and it looks like a very interesting volume. I just wanted to connect with the first question and also with what you said about Southeast Asia. And I speak as a historian. I think perhaps what I'm saying also applies to art history to some extent. And that is that we really need to not just question but reject the use of terms such as colonization and cultural colonization when we look at the art, yes, the history or the religion or the cultural aspects of Southeast Asia. And what I feel is probably one of the biggest stumbling blocks, and that applies probably to what was happening in the certainly from the 1970s onwards, is that although the Greater India model that was put forward by nationalist historians was critiqued, there was nothing else that took its place. Right. And what we do is we remain even more India-centric than we were before. So the prejudices of the 1950s and 40s, 50s, 60s not only continue, they seem to have become stronger because we don't really want to learn about, let's say, Sri Lanka or various parts of Southeast Asia, which we club together as one unit, whereas there is so much diversity. We as Indian scholars are not interested in the histories and the traditions of these other parts of the world for their own sake. Yes. We are only interested in looking at them through the prism of Indian influence and this very, very problematic idea of cultural colonization.
Thank you very much for that. Absolutely correct. This is, and so understanding where they have come from and what selections they have made of material from India, at what terms they accepted Indian material, just as we talk about that in so many ways, that's exactly that filter that needs to be understood. Indeed, that is relevant. No, let's just allow other people, please, to ask a couple of questions. Okay.
I just have a question about what we've been talking about in terms of how we build it into our curricula and our syllabi, because I teach in a history department, I teach art history. So basically what we have is a lot of visual illiteracy that's happening. And there's a lot of emphasis in history writing on text. Not all of us, very many of us have been using a lot of visual material, but inscriptions, the same thing. Epigraphy is a dying art. I think there are very few people who deal with epigraphy any longer. So how do we actually bring it into the primary or at least the secondary school curricula so that it's not just, they're talking about Cholas, so they'll put Brihadeshwara temple, but not build it into the history of the Cholas or build, these kind of concepts of how everything that went into making of visual histories was very much part of mainstream history. It wasn't like it just happened कि भैया उन्होंने वो एक मंदिर बना दिया, लेकिन history continued. It wasn't as if it was actually influencing the history itself. So how do we do that, and what kind of interventions would be required for that? I think that might be one way where we can make a difference.
And I think a specific discussion on this subject, on what we can do to be able to integrate different kinds of visual histories at different stages of learning, needs to be done with people who work specifically in curriculum development. And I don't think we have the time or the wherewithal over here right now today. But your question and your requirement that you have raised is certainly another one that I think we should put down for a subject of a detailed discussion for the future. I'm going to stop over here, but I'll be happy to take your questions over tea. I'd like to ask our next panelists to come up and speak, and then we'll continue with the conversation.
Are you staying here?
No, I'm going to step down while they speak.
Also, I forgot to add, Naman will be, Dr. Ahuja will be moderating the seminar.